Iran is fighting a war it can't admit. Inside the Kurdish Uprising, Tehran is hiding. Right now, in the mountains of western Iran, armed men are moving through terrain the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 4 decades insisting it fully controls. That assumption no longer holds. And while every camera on earth this week has been pointed at Tehran, where millions of mourners walked behind a coffin draped in the Iranian flag, a second, separate war has been quietly escalating 3 provinces away. Iran does not want you to see this one. If you're enjoying this analysis, don't forget to subscribe to Cartovex Media, because the next few minutes completely change the picture. Because what's happening in the Zagros mountains right now isn't a border skirmish. It's the first real test of whether Iran's government can hold its own country together. And the answer is not what Tehran wants the world to think. Let's start with what's confirmed. Late June, 3 provinces, 100 nautical miles of active front. Human rights monitors, including the Kurdistan Human Rights Network and the Henga organization, have independently documented a wave of clashes that researchers are now calling the deadliest confrontation between Tehran and its Kurdish opposition in more than a decade. But the sequencing is where this gets interesting. Night of June 27th, the Gagash Heights, between Mahabad and Piranshar, fighters from the Eastern Kurdistan defense units come under sustained artillery fire from an IRGC headquarters unit. Hours of combat. 4 Kurdish fighters confirmed dead, 2 women, 2 men. The IRGC claims 6 kills. That number has not been independently confirmed by anyone outside Iran's own state apparatus. 2 days later, something changes. A group nobody has heard of before this moment calls itself Koriheva. Its first claimed operation isn't in the mountains at all. It's inside a city, Pave, in Kermanshah province. 2 IRGC-linked personnel shot dead outside their own homes. That detail should stop you. A city, not a remote outpost. Because that's not border friction, that's operational reach. That's a group that already knows exactly where its targets sleep. Then comes July 1st, the night that changes everything. A vehicle near the village of Kezrabad. 6 fighters from the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, on what their party describes as a political and organizational mission, not a combat operation. The IRGC ambushes them. All 6 are killed. Iranian state media reports 5 deaths. It omits one name entirely, Mohammad Amin Bayazidi, reportedly the driver, and reportedly an active member of the party's underground network inside Iran itself. But here's what almost nobody noticed about that specific omission. If Iran wanted to hide one name out of 6, it likely wasn't an accident. It suggests Tehran didn't want the world to understand exactly how deep this particular network already reached inside its own cities. And the killing didn't stop there. 3 police officers dead at a checkpoint in Baneh, a 3-year-old girl wounded in the same crossfire. A separate checkpoint attack on the Baneh-Sakez road kills 3 more government personnel. Independent researchers compiling the confirmed toll across this entire window count at least 21 deaths, 7 Iranian security personnel, 14 Kurdish fighters, with some estimates running higher once disputed claims are factored in. The president of the American Kurdish Committee put it bluntly to reporters, this is not business as usual. This is operations, and it's happening deep inside Iranian territory. But there's another piece of the same window that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it matters more than it looks. In the Kurdish town of Mahabad, a 19-year-old man was reportedly stabbed to death by a group affiliated with the pro-government Basij militia. That single killing didn't stay contained. It reportedly sparked nighttime protests, then a general strike that shut the city down, then a level of open militarization that local sources describe as still ongoing. 1 knife, 1 name, and an entire city effectively paused itself in anger. That's the pattern worth watching here. Every individual incident in this specific window seems to be triggering something larger than itself. A stabbing becomes a strike. An ambush becomes a citywide flashpoint. A single omitted name becomes a question about how deep an underground network actually reaches. So why now? The real question is what actually triggered this. According to Kurdish officials, Iran has carried out more than 850 separate strikes on Kurdish opposition camps and sites since this broader war began back in February, many of them continuing even during the official ceasefire period with Washington. In the days surrounding this exact escalation, Iranian drones reportedly struck PDKI positions in the Balasan Heights, a PDKI camp near Koya, and the PJAK base outside Erbil. The strategy is straightforward: choke the insurgency before its fighters ever cross back into Iranian territory. But here's the problem nobody in Tehran seems to want to say out loud. That strategy has a structural flaw baked into it. The most capable elements of these Kurdish factions aren't sitting in exposed camps waiting to be hit. They're embedded in tunnel networks and cave systems built up over literal decades, the same kind of terrain where an American aircrew reportedly evaded capture earlier in this war, inside cave systems that existed years before that incident ever happened. Drone strikes against terrain like that achieve almost nothing lasting. Iran may be spending down its own drone inventory against targets it fundamentally cannot destroy, while the actual command structure of the Kurdish coalition sits largely untouched. This is where the story gets bigger, because this isn't one militia, it's a coalition. Back in December, 7 separate Iranian Kurdish opposition groups joined forces to support the anti-government protest wave sweeping the country. Then, just 6 days before the American and Israeli strikes had opened this war, 5 of the largest parties, the PDKI, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, the Kurdistan Free Life Party, Chabad, and Komala, formally united under a single coalition with one explicit goal: toppling the regime. For months, that coalition held back. When international outlets reported the Kurdish ground offensive was already underway near Marivan in the war's opening days, the coalition's own parties denied it. Officials inside Iraqi Kurdistan said not a single fighter had crossed the border. The IRGC dismissed it all as, in its own words, subversive misinformation. That caution appears to be eroding now, and the reason is almost mathematical. Hundreds of strikes absorbed over months, even during ceasefire periods, have a way of shifting a coalition's calculus from restraint toward retaliation. But here's what's easy to miss inside all of this. It may not even be one coordinated campaign. Researchers mapping this exact 2-week window have identified at least 3 distinct, largely separate operating patterns running in parallel. The Eastern Kurdistan defense units, locked in a cycle of retaliation. The PDKI, suffering losses through what looks like clandestine units whose movements Iranian forces apparently knew about in advance, a sign of intelligence penetration the party will need to address. And Kori Hiwa, pursuing something else entirely, targeted killings of specific individuals, not open combat. 3 groups, 3 different methods, no clear evidence of a single shared command room. Which means this may be less a single deliberate offensive and more several separate breaking points, reached independently at almost exactly the same time. Now overlay the terrain itself onto this picture, because the terrain is doing more work here than any single fighter. Ridgelines past 10,000 feet, gorges with no meaningful road access, valleys that funnel any mechanized column onto a single vulnerable route with no way to maneuver around an ambush. Iranian helicopter gunships, already flying aging, underpowered airframes, struggle to operate effectively at these altitudes at all, meaning the IRGC is largely fighting this specific campaign without meaningful air support. The defenders have memorized every fold of ground that outside forces are only now being forced to relearn under fire. And the coalition fighting on that ground brings 5 very different capabilities to the table. The Eastern Kurdistan defense units, widely regarded as the most battle-hardened, drawing on more than 2 decades of guerrilla experience, with a notably significant number of women in combat roles, running 6-man infiltration teams under cover of darkness. The PDKI, built less around direct combat and more around deep human intelligence networks, reaching inside Kurdish-majority cities. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, the coalition's most consistently offensive-minded element, running planned strikes on IRGC infrastructure for years before this war even began. And Komala and Chabad, bringing their own long institutional history to this exact stretch of border. But this is where the story shifts from tactics to something much larger, because the real question isn't why the Kurds are fighting harder, it's why Iran can no longer see them coming. During the opening weeks of this broader war, American and Israeli strikes reportedly targeted Iranian radar installations, command nodes, and air defense infrastructure across huge stretches of the country, including sites along this exact front that had previously helped Iran monitor Kurdish movement. Those early warning systems, by multiple accounts, went dark and reportedly have not been meaningfully restored. Whether that was a deliberate side effect of a much larger campaign, or simply collateral damage from a war focused primarily on nuclear infrastructure and the Strait of Hormuz, is genuinely difficult to say with certainty from the outside. But the practical effect is identical either way. Iran's ability to detect Kurdish infiltration along this corridor has been degraded at precisely the moment Kurdish frustration was building toward exactly this kind of response. And there have been persistent, credible reports throughout this war of American and Israeli discussions about more directly supporting these factions. Early on, the American president publicly said he wanted Kurdish forces to succeed against the regime. Major outlets have reported on serious internal discussions about providing more direct assistance. It remains genuinely unclear from the outside how much of that support, if any, is actually flowing right now. What is confirmed is the casualty list, real names, independently verified. What remains speculative is the extent of any outside technical support. That distinction matters, and we're not going to blur it for you. There's also a complication sitting quietly underneath all of this, and it involves a NATO ally. Turkey has consistently and firmly opposed any significant American or Israeli arming of Iranian Kurdish factions, specifically because of organizational links between the Kurdistan Free Life Party and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, a group Ankara has fought inside its own borders for decades and formally designated a terrorist organization. That opposition reportedly played a real role in scaling back more direct American support plans earlier in this war, even after the American president had publicly voiced support for Kurdish success. Which means Washington's calculation here isn't simple at all. Supporting this insurgency more directly risks straining relations with a NATO ally with its own deeply sensitive history tied to a closely related movement. And that history is shifting under everyone's feet at the exact same moment. Turkey has spent the past year pursuing its own separate settlement with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, working toward an arrangement that would see that group disarm entirely and end a conflict measured in decades. Layer a fresh Kurdish uprising inside Iran on top of that delicate, unfinished Turkish process, and you get a genuinely uncomfortable question for Ankara. Does a successful Kurdish push against Tehran strengthen the broader Kurdish political movement across the entire region, including inside Turkey's own borders, at the precise moment Ankara is trying to wind a related conflict down, rather than watch a new one catch fire next door? That's not a minor diplomatic footnote. That's the reason Washington's options here are far narrower than raw military logic alone would suggest. Meanwhile, Iran's own senior leadership is showing signs that look nothing like confident control. The commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Guards made a rare public appearance during this same window, his first since the war began, wearing a plain baseball cap, surrounded by plainclothes security rather than a formal military escort. That is not the posture of a man operating from strength inside his own country. And this insurgency is accelerating at precisely the moment Iran's leadership structure looks most fractured. The country's new supreme leader has reportedly not made a single public appearance since his predecessor was killed in the strikes that opened this war, communicating only through written statements, reportedly because of a credible, publicly acknowledged assassination threat against him. Layered that leadership vacuum on top of an active, multi-province insurgency, on top of a fragile, unresolved ceasefire with the United States, on top of a nationally televised funeral meant to project unity, but reportedly met with real indifference from parts of Iran's own population, and you start to see an organization under genuinely serious, compounding strain, fighting on more fronts than it has the capacity to comfortably manage. None of this is happening without real cost to ordinary people. Regional reporting indicates Iran's own cross-border strikes against Kurdish camps have caused disruptions well beyond the camps themselves, including reported interruptions to gas supplies feeding regional power stations, a self-inflicted cost from Iran's own attempt to choke off Kurdish logistics. Now overlay the single biggest deadline still hanging over this entire conflict, because it connects directly to why this specific moment matters so much. The memorandum signed between Washington and Tehran back on June 17th established a 60-day negotiating window, expiring around mid-August. Iran's own ambassador has told an international forum that Tehran intends to begin charging service fees on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz once that window closes, and has reportedly already presented a joint fee framework to Washington alongside Oman. The United States rejected that framework immediately, with American officials stating flatly that no country is permitted to charge fees on an international waterway. But think about what that specific dispute actually represents. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the narrowest choke points in the entire global economy, a corridor that a meaningful share of the world's seaborne oil passes through every single day. Any credible threat to disrupt or tax that flow ripples outward instantly, into shipping insurance premiums, into tanker routing decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away, into energy futures markets that respond to rumor as quickly as they respond to confirmed fact. Iran doesn't need to actually block a single ship to move that needle. The mere threat, timed against an expiring diplomatic deadline, is itself a form of leverage. So think about the position Iran's leadership actually occupies as that deadline approaches. Holding together a fragile ceasefire, managing an unresolved dispute over one of the most economically consequential waterways on the planet, staging an enormous funeral to project unity, and now fighting an intensifying multi-front insurgency along its own western border, all while its actual head of state remains unseen by his own population for more than 4 months running. That is an extraordinary amount of simultaneous pressure for any government to absorb. And this is not happening in a vacuum separate from the rest of the world's security picture. In North Korea, Kim Jong-un has personally supervised weapons trials aboard a new guided missile destroyer this past week. A reminder that multiple flashpoints are developing simultaneously across the globe right now, each drawing limited international attention, even as every individual crisis continues escalating on its own separate timeline. So where does this actually leave Iran as this week draws to a close? A coalition of Kurdish forces with real tactical skill and deep terrain knowledge has killed a documented, independently verified number of Iranian security personnel across multiple provinces in roughly 2 weeks, while absorbing serious losses of its own. Iran's response, hundreds of cross-border strikes, has produced minimal lasting effect against an enemy embedded in terrain built for exactly this kind of fight. Iran's senior military leadership is making rare, cautious appearances under disguised security rather than visible confidence, and every one of these developments is unfolding directly alongside a fragile ceasefire, an unresolved Hormuz deadline, and a leadership vacuum at the very top of the entire government. Whether this becomes the opening chapter of something considerably larger, a genuine unraveling of Iranian control over its own western periphery at the exact moment its central government is most vulnerable, or whether it settles back into the kind of lower intensity friction that has defined this border for decades, is a question even analysts closely tracking this region have been reluctant to answer with confidence. Some point to the high casualty rate among Kurdish forces as evidence of real operational limits. Others point to the sheer geographic spread. 3 provinces, multiple groups, all erupting within the same narrow window, as evidence that something genuinely different is happening. There's a third view worth holding alongside those two, because it may end up being the most accurate one. It's the possibility that both readings are true at once. That this coalition is genuinely capable of sustained, high-casualty resistance in terrain built for exactly that kind of fight, and that it is simultaneously nowhere near capable of the kind of decisive territory-holding offensive that would actually topple anything on its own. An insurgency doesn't need to win outright to matter strategically. It only needs to be expensive enough, persistent enough, and public enough to force a government already stretched across multiple fronts to keep diverting resources it would rather spend elsewhere. That by itself is a form of pressure Iran's leadership cannot simply wait out. And that's really the deeper strategic story sitting underneath all of the individual ambushes and checkpoint attacks. Every government eventually reaches a point where it's managing too many simultaneous emergencies to fully resolve any single one of them. A fragile ceasefire that could collapse over a shipping dispute. A funeral meant to project unity that instead revealed how thin that unity actually is. A new leader nobody has seen. And now, a western border that no longer behaves the way Tehran's own maps say it should. None of these threats individually looks like it could bring down a government with 4 decades of institutional muscle behind it. But stacked together, at the same moment, they start to look like something closer to a genuine stress test of the entire system. What's beyond dispute is the list of names now sitting in the documented record, verified by independent human rights organizations tracking this region in real time. Karo Hormuzyari, Fardin Changisi, Mohammad Kaki, Abdullah Mohammadpour, Twana Osmani, Mohammad Amin Bayazidi, Mardin Ahmadi, and dozens of others attached to this exact 2-week window. The actual human cost sitting underneath every strategic analysis of drones, terrain, and coalition structure. Whatever comes next in these mountains, the people living through it on every side of every checkpoint are the ones bearing the weight of a conflict most of the world has been too distracted to notice, and will likely remain so until the next round of names is added to a list that has, so far, shown no sign of stopping. For now, the fight in the Zagros Mountains continues on its own terms, largely unwatched, largely unresolved, and very much still underway.